London was a far cry from California. Amanda felt it in her bones. Gone was the familiar warmth of the sun. In its place, a cold, damp air clung to the city. Towering buildings cast long shadows, remnants of a history she was just beginning to understand. Cobblestone streets echoed with the footsteps of strangers. Amanda was determined to make this new life her own. London was a challenge, a puzzle she was determined to solve. The city's energy, both chaotic and captivating, was already seeping into her soul. Nighttime in London was a different beast. The fog rolled in, thick and heavy, swallowing the city in its embrace. Shadows danced in the flickering gaslight, stretching and twisting into monstrous shapes. Amanda, a creature of the night herself, found a strange comfort in the darkness. The city's nocturnal rhythm resonated with her soul. While others sought solace in daylight, Amanda embraced the shadows. She felt most alive in those quiet, stolen hours after the sun had set. The city's energy shifted, becoming something more subdued, more secretive. But beneath the surface, a current of unease ran through her. Her sanctuary became a small, unassuming cafe tucked away on a side street. The Midnight Brew, its sign proclaimed in faded gold lettering. It was a haven for night owls, insomniacs, and dreamers. Its dim lighting and the aroma of strong coffee provided a sense of warmth and belonging. Amanda would often find herself drawn to its warm glow late at night. The gentle clinking of cups, the murmur of hushed conversations, the aroma of coffee and spices. It was a sensory experience that soothed her soul. She'd settle into a worn leather armchair, a steaming mug of decaf cradled in her hands. Lost in the pages of a good book, she could almost forget the anxieties that plagued her during the day. The cafe was her escape, a place where she could simply be. Little did she know that her late-night ritual had attracted an unwanted observer. He was a phantom, a whisper in the night. A man of shadows and secrets, drawn to the glow of the midnight brew like a moth to a flickering flame. He blended into the background noise of the cafe, an anonymous figure amidst the late-night crowd. No one paid him much attention, and that's precisely how he liked it. His eyes, however, were constantly moving, scanning the room, taking in every detail. He was a predator, and the midnight brew was his hunting ground. He observed the late-night patrons, their routines, their vulnerabilities, but it was Amanda who caught his eye. He began to make a habit of sitting at the same table every night, always within view of Amanda. Section 2. Fleeting Glances. Amanda, lost in the pages of her book, was oblivious to the attention she was receiving. She was used to the anonymous hum of the cafe, the low murmur of conversations, the clatter of cups and saucers. It was a comforting soundtrack to her late-night ritual. She would occasionally glance up from her book, her eyes scanning the room without really seeing. It was more of a reflex, a way to ground herself in the present moment. But her gaze never lingered on any one person for too long. She had noticed him, vaguely, a few times. He was always sitting in the same spot, nursing the same cup of coffee. Section 3. Unsettling Awareness. The feeling began as a prickle on the back of her neck, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. At first, Amanda dismissed it as nothing more than her imagination, fueled by the dark narratives she consumed in her books. But as the nights wore on, the feeling intensified. It was as if someone was watching her, their gaze following her every move. She would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, a shadow shifting in the periphery. She started to pay more attention to her surroundings, scanning the faces of the other patrons in the cafe. But her search yielded nothing. Section 4. Seeds of Doubt. The feeling of being watched followed her home, seeping into the sanctuary of her small apartment. She began to question her own sanity, wondering if she was letting her imagination run wild. She would double-check the locks on her door, her windows, even though she knew she had already secured them. Her once comforting routines, her late-night trips to the midnight brew, her solitary walks home, were now tainted with fear. She felt like a prisoner in her own life, trapped by an invisible threat. Her phone buzzed, a jarring sound in the quiet apartment. Amanda's pulse quickened. It was a text, from an unknown number. Her finger hovered over the notification, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. Taking a deep breath, she opened the message. 3 words, chilling in their simplicity. I see you. A wave of nausea washed over her. It was just a text, she told herself. A cruel prank. But deep down, a primal fear whispered that it was something more. Days turned into a blurry torment. The texts continued, each one a hammer blow to her fragile sense of security. You looked beautiful tonight. You shouldn't walk home alone. They were vague, yet their intent was clear. He was watching her. The city, once exhilarating, now felt like a hunting ground. She avoided the cafe, her former haven now a source of terror. But it didn't matter. He knew her routines, her habits. The messages grew bolder, more specific. He described her clothing, her habits, even the way she nervously tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Details only someone watching her closely could know. Her blood ran cold. She went to the police, her voice trembling as she recounted the escalating terror. But the anonymous texts, the lack of a physical threat, left them with little to go on. They promised to investigate, but their words rang hollow. She was alone. The fear that had been a simmering dread now erupted into full-blown panic. Sleep, when it came, offered no escape. Nightmares plagued her, vivid and terrifying. He was always there, lurking in the shadows, his face obscured, his eyes burning with a cold, predatory light. She started seeing him everywhere, his face a fleeting glimpse in a crowd, a shadow disappearing around a corner. Her senses were on high alert, every sound magnified, every shadow a potential threat. Her once organized life dissolved into chaos. Work became impossible, her concentration shattered. I'm coming for you, the text read, simple, direct, and utterly chilling. The words echoed in the silence of her apartment, amplifying her terror. He was no longer content to watch from afar, he was coming closer. Panic threatened to consume her, but she clung to a sliver of defiance. She wouldn't be an easy victim. She grabbed the baseball bat she kept under her bed, her hand shaking as she gripped the worn wood. It was a pathetic defense, but it was all she had. That night, the creaks and groans of her old building seemed louder, more menacing. Days crawled by, each one an agonizing eternity. The silence from the stalker was more unnerving than the texts. It was the quiet before a storm, a suffocating stillness that pressed down on Amanda, stealing her breath. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like a prey animal sensing the predator's presence but unable to pinpoint its location. Her sleep was plagued by nightmares, vivid and unsettling, filled with shadowy figures and menacing whispers. Her apartment, once a haven, now felt like a prison. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the old plumbing sent shivers down her spine. Her phone buzzed, the sound cutting through the silence like a siren. Amanda flinched, her heart leaping into her throat. The screen illuminated her face, the glow casting harsh shadows in the darkness. It was him, 2 words, terse, unemotional. I'm outside. A cold dread washed over her, numbing her limbs. He was no longer content with cryptic messages, with toying with her from afar. Days turned into weeks. The stalker remained a phantom, a menacing presence lurking just beyond her reach. The fear, however, was a constant companion, a shadow that clung to her every move. She'd tried everything, changing her routines, her phone number, even her appearance. She'd reported the stalking to the police, but their investigation had stalled, hampered by the lack of concrete evidence. Desperate for a sense of normalcy, she'd ventured back to the Midnight Brew, hoping that familiarity might offer some solace. But the cafe, once her sanctuary, was now a constant reminder of her vulnerability. Every creak of the door, every whisper in the darkness, sent her heart racing. One evening, as Amanda sat in her darkened apartment, her phone buzzed with a message. It was another unknown number, but this time the message was different. It wasn't a threat, but a plea, a desperate cry for help. He's after me now too, the message read. Please help me. He knows about the cafe. A surge of adrenaline shot through Amanda, chasing away the paralysis of fear. For months she'd been consumed by her own terror, believing herself to be alone in this nightmare. Now, she realized, there was someone else. Another victim caught in the stalker's web. For the first time since this nightmare began, Amanda felt a flicker of hope. He'd made a mistake. He'd underestimated his victims, their resilience, their capacity for empathy and courage, and this mistake, she vowed, would be his downfall. Section 5. A desperate plea. Amanda knew she had to act fast. She didn't know the identity of the other victim, but the mention of the cafe was a crucial clue. He was watching them both, using their shared haven as a hunting ground. Her fingers flew across the phone's keyboard, her mind racing. "Don't go to the police," she typed. "He'll be expecting that. We need to be smart. Meet me at the park across from the cafe tomorrow night at 10 p.m. Come alone," and delete this message. Sending the message, Amanda felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with trepidation. She didn't know if the other victim would trust her, if they would even see the message in time. But it was the only chance they had. As she waited for a response, the fear that had been her constant companion for months began to morph into something else: determination. A fierce resolve to fight back, to expose the stalker and end his reign of terror once and for all. She was no longer just a victim, she was a hunter now. Section 1. The confrontation. Amanda lay awake. Every nerve ending throbbed with a mixture of fear and anticipation. He was in her apartment. She knew it. The air itself felt different, charged with a dark energy. Earlier that night she'd heard the floorboards creak outside her door, just a soft, insidious sound, but enough to send chills down her spine. He was toying with her, letting her know he was close enough to touch. She gripped the baseball bat tighter, her knuckles white in the darkness, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silence. The digital clock on her nightstand glowed an ominous red 3 a.m., the witching hour. A wave of nausea washed over her. She had to get out of this apartment, now. Suddenly, a crash from the living room shattered the silence. Amanda bolted upright, her breath catching in her throat. He was inside. There was no more time for fear, only action. Section 2. Fight or flight. Adrenaline surged through Amanda's veins. Her fear was a living thing now, propelling her forward. She crept towards the bedroom door, each step agonizingly slow. The baseball bat felt heavy in her trembling hands, but it was all that stood between her and him. The hallway was dark, the only light filtering in from the streetlights outside. Shadows danced on the walls, taking on menacing shapes. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old building sounded like a whispered threat. Then, she saw him. A silhouetted figure standing in the living room, his back to her. He was hunched over something on the coffee table. She couldn't make out what it was, but a cold dread filled her. It was too late to run. He'd hear her. Her only option was to fight. With a surge of desperate courage, Amanda charged into the living room, her scream ripping through the silence. She swung the bat with all her might, aiming for his head. The bat connected with a sickening thud, and the figure crumpled to the floor. Silence descended once again, heavy and absolute. Amanda stood frozen, her chest heaving, the baseball bat trembling in her grip. Her mind struggled to process what had just happened. Had she really just... Slowly, cautiously, she approached the figure lying motionless on the floor. The room was illuminated only by the faint glow of the city outside, casting long, distorted shadows. It was difficult to see, but as she drew closer, she realized something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The figure on the floor wasn't the stalker. It was her landlord, Mr. Henderson. He lay sprawled on the floor, his eyes vacant, a thin trickle of blood staining his temple. He was still clutching a screwdriver in his hand. The air rushed out of Amanda's lungs. This wasn't her nightmare, it was someone else's. She was both victim and unwitting perpetrator in a tragedy not of her making. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. Looking around the apartment, she saw the chaos, the signs of a struggle, the overturned furniture, the broken lamp. Mr. Henderson hadn't been attacking her, he'd been trying to protect her. He must have heard the stalker, come to investigate and walked in on... The weight of it all crashed down on her, the months of fear, the relentless stalking, the constant dread, all culminating in this. Her legs gave way and she sank to the floor, her back against the wall, her eyes fixed on the horrifying tableau before her. She was safe now, but at what cost? The police sirens wailed in the distance, a symphony of approaching chaos. But Amanda couldn't bring herself to move. She sat huddled on the floor of her ransacked apartment, the weight of the night pressing down on her like a physical burden. The events played over and over in her mind, a horrific loop she couldn't escape. The image of Mr. Henderson lifeless on her living room floor haunted her, his kind eyes now forever closed, his gentle smile extinguished. She'd come to London seeking a fresh start, a chance to escape the ghosts of her past. Now she was leaving with a new ghost, one that would forever be tethered to her soul. London held nothing for her but pain and terror. She packed a single suitcase, her movements mechanical, her emotions numb. She didn't bother to sort through the debris of her life, the overturned furniture, the scattered belongings. It all felt tainted, poisoned by the events of that night. The next morning, she boarded a plane, the roar of the engines a deafening counterpoint to the silence in her heart. As the plane soared above the clouds, leaving London behind, a single tear traced a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of relief. She was free. Or was she? California welcomed her back with open arms, the familiar warmth of the sun a balm to her soul. She tried to rebuild her life, to piece together the shattered fragments of her former self. She found solace in the familiar rhythms of her childhood, the scent of the ocean breeze, the laughter of loved ones. But the shadows of that night in London followed her, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of her carefully constructed normalcy. She couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on her back, the prickling unease of being watched. She avoided crowds, shied away from strangers, her senses perpetually on high alert. Every creak in the night, every unexpected noise, sent a jolt of fear through her. The stalker might be gone, but the terror he'd inflicted lingered, a venomous seed planted deep within her psyche. She often thought about the other victim, the one who had reached out to her in a moment of shared desperation. Had they escaped the stalker's clutches, or had they too become ensnared in his web of terror? The questions haunted her, a constant reminder of the darkness that could lie hidden beneath the veneer of normalcy. Amanda might have escaped the physical clutches of the Night Stalker, but his presence lingered, a specter haunting the edges of her carefully constructed peace. The experience had changed her irrevocably. She was no longer the carefree young woman who had arrived in London so full of hope and optimism. She was a survivor, forever marked by the darkness she had encountered. And in the depths of her heart, she knew that the shadows would always be there, waiting to reclaim her.